Welcome to the Dub Dive. Today we're jumping into a really wild story involving the rapper French Montana. It's about this incident back in 2003. Seriously strange stuff. Imagine this. A guy gets ambushed, shot in the head, somehow survives, and then, get this, he finds himself charged with murder for the same event where he was the victim.
Yeah, it's a total legal head scratcher. And that's our mission today, right? To really unpack for you how this could even happen, we need to look at the legal angles, things like, causation, self-defense arguments, and maybe most importantly, the burden of proof. These are the things that took him from being the target of an attack to suddenly being the defendant. And then, well, how the case eventually got dropped.
Exactly. That journey, victim to accused, that's what we want to trace out for you. Now, our info comes mainly from media interviews with Montana himself, plus some case analysis. We should say up front, detailed court records from back then aren't really public, so there are limits. But the legal picture we can piece together is fascinating.
Definitely. Okay, let's set the scene. We're in New York City, 2003. This is way before French Montana was famous. He's basically just an aspiring artist doing his thing. He's leaving a recording studio in the Bronx, probably late.
And right away, it's clear this wasn't just some random mugging. The sources we have point to this being like a planned hit, an ambush, two gunmen waiting for him.
Yeah, and the really shocking part, the personal betrayal element. According to Montana, the whole thing was set up, orchestrated by someone he knew, someone he actually called a friend.
Wow. Just think about that. Trying to make it in the music world, which is tough enough. And the biggest danger turns out to be someone in your own circle. That's rough.
It really highlights something, doesn't it? These environments, especially for up-and-coming artists in certain scenes, they can be incredibly volatile. You hear about intense rivalries, sure, but this level of betrayal being set up by a supposed friend, it tells you a lot about the risks involved.
Absolutely. Okay, so the attack happens. What were the immediate consequences for Montana?
Near fatal. He was shot in the back of the head. It wasn't superficial. He was in the hospital for weeks recovering. And apparently, he still has scars from it today.
So, no question, he was the intended victim, seriously injured. But then comes the twist, the part that flips the whole legal script.
Running this chaos, this shootout, one of the attackers dies.
Okay, wait. If Montana was the one shot, how did one of the guys attacking him end up dead? Did he fight back? Did he have a weapon?
That's the million-dollar question, and what the authorities reportedly figured out is, well, almost unbelievable. They determined the attacker who died was killed by friendly fire.
Friendly fire, you mean?
His own partner. The other gunman accidentally shot him while they were both trying to shoot Montana.
Oh, wow. So the attacker was killed by his accomplice. That is incredibly messy, and that's what led to the charges against Montana.
Exactly. That accidental death is the pivot point for everything that followed legally.
So let me get this straight. The guy shot in the head, recovering in the hospital, is now facing what exactly?
Murder charges.
Murder. How? That just doesn't compute for most people. If the other guy's partner shot him.
It seems completely backwards, I know. But you have to look at the likely legal strategy here. The prosecution was probably pushing a theory based on something like felony murder or a related idea about causation.
Okay, break that down, because usually you think murder means you killed someone intentionally.
Right. But felony murder rules can be broad. Sometimes, if a death happens during the commission of a dangerous felony you were involved in, you can be held responsible, even if you didn't directly cause the death. Now, here it gets tricky because Montana was the victim. But in chaotic shootouts, prosecutors might argue that the victim's response, even if it's self-defense, somehow created the dangerous situation where someone died. They might try to argue that by, say, resisting or maybe firing back, he escalated things to the point where the friendly fire incident became, legally speaking, his fault.
So the argument is basically his act of defending himself or just being part of that chaos ultimately led to the death, even if he wasn't the shooter. They're trying to blame the victim for the consequences of the attack on him.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. It's testing the absolute limits of legal responsibility. The law says you can defend yourself, but when things explode into a gunfight with multiple people shooting, figuring out who's legally responsible for every single outcome, including accidental deaths, gets incredibly complicated. They might try to bypass the self-defense angle by focusing solely on the death that occurred.
It sounds like they were trying to force a very messy real-world street incident into a neat legal box that just didn't fit.
Right.
But we know how it ended. He beat the charge, right?
He did. The case was dismissed. And why it was dismissed is key. It came down to lack of evidence. Plain and simple.
Lack of evidence, meaning?
Meaning the prosecution couldn't prove he was legally responsible for the death. They couldn't meet their burden. Remember, in criminal cases, the state has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high bar.
And Montana himself gave a pretty clear explanation, which lines up with this. He said, basically, his own guy shot him by mistake while trying to shoot me.
Exactly, and that statement points right at the core problem for the prosecution. Forensics,
Hmm.
ballistics. In a chaotic shootout like that, with bullets flying from different guns,
Hmm.
unless you can clearly show with solid evidence that the defendant's actions directly led to the fatal shot or that he fired it, the case falls apart, especially if the evidence points towards friendly fire.
So the dismissal wasn't necessarily a court saying perfect self-defense. It was more like the court saying you haven't proven your case. The lack of concrete proof about who shot whom essentially killed the murder charge.
Precisely. The forensic reality was just too murky. They couldn't establish that crucial chain of causation needed to hold Montana responsible for a death caused by his attacker's partner. When the evidence strongly suggests in friendly fire, that link breaks down.
This whole thing clearly left a mark, not just the physical scars he still has. But this happened right at the start of his career, like before the big hits, before Pop That or any of that. It must have shaped his whole outlook, surviving something like that before he even really got started.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder of the kind of real-world danger and violence that can underpin the journey to success for some artists.
And then there's that final, really bizarre detail you mentioned earlier, the human element. Montana claimed the same guy, the friend who allegedly set him up for the shooting,
Yeah.
also ended up saving his life afterwards.
Right. It's just how do you even process that? The person responsible for you getting shot in the head is also the reason you apparently didn't die. It just throws another layer of complete convolution onto everything.
What does that even mean? Remorse, fear, some messed up loyalty. It speaks volumes about the kind of unstable, shifting dynamics he must have been dealing with. Betrayer one minute, savior the next.
Taking a step back from the specifics, though, this whole incident is really illustrative. It shows the kind of extreme circumstances some people navigate, especially in competitive urban environments. And legally, it shows how thin that line can be between being a victim and suddenly finding yourself tangled up as a defendant because of complex legal doctrines like causation.
So the big takeaway for you, the listener, this case is where intense street violence collided head-on with the, well, sometimes cold logic of the legal system. Montana was shot, he got charged with murder for his attacker's death, and then the case got dropped. Not necessarily because of a clear self-defense ruling, but because the evidence just wasn't there to prove who fired the fatal shot.
And that brings us to a fundamental point about how our justice system is supposed to work. It hinges on proof, on clear, provable causation. What this case really hammers home is the power of missing evidence, or ambiguous evidence. When the facts on the ground are chaotic, when the forensics like ballistics can't give a definitive answer, the state just can't meet that high burden of proof needed for a conviction, especially for something as serious as murder. Even against the initial victim, what does that tell us about trying to find clear justice when reality is that messy?
It's a really potent thought, a stark reminder that in the fog of violence and betrayal, the legal lines can blur, and proving anything beyond a reasonable doubt becomes incredibly difficult. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.